Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. Creepypasta are great, but does anyone have any good true creepy stories? Story 1. Was it real?
A few weeks ago, my girlfriend and I were tucked in for the night, fast asleep in our shared bed. It was just another peaceful evening, or so I thought. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was pulled from my slumber by her voice cutting through the darkness. "What are you doing?" she asked, her tone sharp and urgent. Now, my girlfriend is no stranger to talking in her sleep, so initially I was not too concerned. However, this time her words were so clear and her tone so pressing that it instantly jolted me awake. Rubbing my eyes, I asked her what was wrong. She blinked a few times, coming out of her grogginess, and said, "I thought I saw someone at the end of the bed." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I brushed it off, assuming it was just a vivid dream or one of those semi-awake hallucinations that people sometimes experience. I comforted her, assuring her it was nothing, and eventually we both drifted back to sleep. About an hour later, I woke up again, but this time it was different. My eyes adjusted to the dim light in the room, and my heart skipped a beat. There, at the end of the bed, I saw a figure, someone standing on the mattress. The figure was not just standing. They were wrapped in our bed sheets, twisted tightly around their body all the way up to their neck. The image was surreal and horrifying, like something out of a nightmare. I did not know what to do. My body froze, my mind raced, and the only words that escaped my mouth were, "What are you doing?" As soon as I spoke, everything shifted. My girlfriend shook me awake, her voice filled with concern. "You were having a bad dream," she said. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The air in the room felt heavy as I processed what had just happened. When I explained my dream to her, the color drained from her face. She told me that what I described was exactly what she had seen in her dream earlier. The figure at the end of the bed, the twisted sheets, the eerie presence. She had woken up and said, "What are you doing?" And now, I had done the exact same thing. We sat there in stunned silence for a while, unable to comprehend how we had both experienced the same unsettling vision. Was it just a coincidence? A strange connection between us? Or was there something or someone sharing the room with us that night? To this day, neither of us has an answer. But the memory of that figure standing at the end of the bed, wrapped in sheets, still haunts us both.
Story 2. Myrtle's Plantation.
When I was in 8th grade, I went on a school trip called the Louisiana Tour. It was primarily focused on visiting significant historical sites in southern Louisiana. One of the stops on our itinerary was Myrtle's Plantation, which is widely regarded as one of the most haunted locations in the United States. The plantation is steeped in history and has countless ghost stories associated with it. During our visit, we were standing in a room as part of a larger tour group, while the guide was sharing information about the site. I do not remember exactly what they were talking about at that moment, but as I stood there, I started hearing a sound that resembled someone striking a piano key. I heard it a couple of times and began looking around the room to find the source of the sound. Strangely, I did not see a piano, yet the sound persisted. I asked my friends standing nearby if they could hear it too, but they all said no. When I heard it again, I insisted, "There it is again. You must have heard that." But my friends just looked at me like I was imagining things. Feeling a bit perplexed, I resumed scanning the room. Most people in the group were focused on the tour guide, but I noticed one woman standing across from me who seemed different. She caught my eye and gestured by pointing at me and then to her ear with a questioning look. I realized she was silently asking if I could hear it as well. When I nodded, she nodded back, confirming that she was hearing the exact same sound. Right at that moment, the tour guide began sharing a story about a soldier who had died at the plantation. The guide explained that he was known to play the piano during his life, and that many guests had reported hearing phantom piano music in the night. I was stunned. The timing of the story perfectly matched what I had just experienced. As the group moved on, I had the chance to speak with the woman who had heard the sound. She confirmed that she had heard exactly what I did, but interestingly, her husband and son, who were with her, had not heard a thing. To this day, I still cannot explain what I experienced in that room. It remains one of the most mysterious and unexplainable moments of my life.
Story 3. Haunted Doll.
I work at Myrtle's Plantation, one of the most haunted places in the United States. Over the years, I have heard countless chilling stories from visitors, but one tale stands out to me as the most unsettling. The plantation also operates as a bed and breakfast, allowing guests to stay overnight in its historic rooms. One of these rooms is infamous among staff and guests alike. It is filled with antique ceramic dolls, each one uniquely eerie. Among them is one doll with a particularly haunting backstory. The doll once belonged to a little girl who lived at the plantation long ago. It was her favorite toy, always by her side, even when she slept. Tragically, the child passed away under mysterious circumstances. After her death, the doll was left on her bed in her memory. When the plantation began housing guests, the staff decided to keep the doll on the bed as a tribute to the child, never imagining the strange events that would follow. The first night a guest stayed in the room, she moved the doll to make herself more comfortable. The next morning, she stormed out of the room, visibly shaken and accusing the staff of tampering with her belongings during the night. According to her, she had woken up to find the doll back on the bed with its hands on her throat. She was adamant that someone must have entered the room, but the staff reassured her that no one had come in. Despite their assurances, the guests left the plantation deeply disturbed. Another guest who stayed in the same room experienced something equally chilling. He moved the doll off the bed before going to sleep, placing it on a nearby dresser. In the middle of the night, he was woken by faint tapping sounds coming from the wooden floor. When he looked over, he saw the doll sitting upright on the floor, staring directly at him. The tapping had been coming from the very spot where the doll now sat. Somehow, it had moved from the dresser to the floor on its own. This pattern has repeated itself with countless guests over the years. Anyone who moves the doll reports finding it back on the bed, often in ways that defy explanation. Some guests hear strange noises. Others find the doll in places it should not be, and nearly all leave the room deeply unnerved. This doll's uncanny behavior has solidified its reputation as one of the plantation's most haunted artifacts, leaving both guests and staff with an eerie sense of unease. Whether it is the spirit of the child lingering or something far more sinister, its mystery remains unsolved.
Story 4. Imaginary Friend.
When I was younger, I had an imaginary friend who lived in this massive antique dresser. We would hang out together, and I vividly remember him telling me stories, although I have absolutely no recollection of what those stories were. One day I was talking to my parents about it. My dad travelled quite a bit, so he wasn't up to date with what I was into. When I started telling him about my dresser buddy, he wanted to know his name. It was something simple like Peter or Patrick, but I can still remember seeing him go pale in the face. I drew my friend out for him, and the very next day my dad and my uncle took out that dresser and burned it. It wasn't until a few years later that I found out my dad's little brother had also had the same friend, with the same name, living in the same antique dresser. After a few months of the usual imaginary friend stuff, my uncle started having night terrors and couldn't sleep because of Peter. It got so bad that they had to move him out of his room before he could get back to normal. The dresser was an old, dark wood, unattractive piece. As far as we know, it belonged to my great-great-great-grandfather, who was known to have been involved in some strange activities if family history is to be believed. My dad never talked about what was actually inside the dresser, and he was the only one who believed his brother when they were kids. Their parents didn't take it seriously, as they just thought kids were imagining things. Who really believes in spooky ghosts, right? It must have been a shock when, 30 years later, his own son started having the same friend. My uncle's night terrors ended when they moved him to another room. The bedroom he had been in with the dresser was converted into a little sitting room, since it had a nice view. It remained relatively unoccupied until my dad moved our family into that home, and that room became mine. I haven't seen my uncle in 14 years, and we don't really speak anymore since he's on the other side of the world. I'm afraid to bring something like this up because I know he struggles with depression and alcoholism, and I wouldn't want to add more to his plate. To everyone asking what he looked like, I remember him as a tiny old man. Not like an old man tiny, but kid-sized tiny. He had very large hands, long fingers. This is probably why I draw people with disproportionately long and larger hands today. He smelled like wood, mothballs, old clothes, and what I now know was mold.
Story 5. Skeptic's Paranormal Encounter.
I'll try to get through this without breaking down. It is still kind of chilling to think about. Around the time I was 19 years old, I was deployed to Iraq. My unit worked with explosives, and honestly, I did not know if I would make it home safely. About halfway through my tour, the American Red Cross notified my unit that my father was terminally ill. Within a week, I was on a plane back to the United States. Now, my father being ill was something I had grown used to. He was incredibly strong, though, and I never truly expected to lose him. I lost my mother when I was 7 years old, and my father's lungs had collapsed shortly before then. He relied on oxygen and needed a wheelchair to go anywhere. He required handfuls of medication every few hours. He gained weight due to his limited movement, developed diabetes, and had already beaten cancer once. Despite everything, I never believed I would lose him. He was not the type to give up. When I arrived home, I headed straight to the hospital. My father assured me he was fine and said the doctors were overreacting. I visited him. Every day I was there, but he kept insisting he would be fine by the time I returned home for good. Reluctantly, I went back overseas. I called his hospital whenever I had a few free minutes and access to a call center. Eventually, my deployment ended, and he kept his promise. He came home from the hospital, saying he did not want to pass away there. However, his condition worsened, and he had to return. The whole family visited him, but we knew he was not improving. One day, while I was at home, the phone rang. It was an unknown number, so I did not answer. It went to the answering machine, and a very raspy voice mumbled, "Call the hospital." It was my father. I grabbed the phone, but he had already hung up. I called the hospital, and they told me he had been intubated for the past couple of hours and had just gone into cardiac arrest. He was non-responsive, and they told us to come to say our goodbyes. I argued that he had just called me, but the nurse said that was impossible. They had been working on him for quite some time. I hung up and told my family the news. My sister and I stared at the answering machine. We played the message again and again. That was the last time I heard my father's voice. I am a skeptic. I do not believe in the paranormal or ghosts, and I cannot come up with any logical explanation for this. I still get watery-eyed thinking about it.
Story 6. Hanging by her braid.
It was winter break, about 5 years ago, when I visited my aunt's house in Los Angeles. I was heading to the bathroom on the second floor when I saw my cousin April, who was only 4 years old, sitting on the stairs. She was making all sorts of funny faces, full of energy as usual. Curious, I asked, "What are you doing, April?" With a bright smile, she replied, "I'm copying the lady with the braid." Confused, I glanced around but saw no one else. "What lady?" I asked. She pointed to a beam running parallel to the stairwell. "Her," April said, as though the lady was right there. "She's making funny faces." I started walking up the stairs, but then April's words stopped me in my tracks. She said, casually, her braids are around her neck. My heart skipped. "What did you say?" I turned to face April. She pointed again, saying, "The lady is hanging by her braid. She's making funny faces." I stared at her, trying to understand, but then April made a face. A twisted, gasping expression, like someone struggling to breathe. My stomach turned. There was something unsettling about the way she imitated it, so lifelike, so real. I couldn't shake the feeling that April had seen something I couldn't, something that wasn't just in her imagination. The room felt suddenly heavy, and I couldn't stop thinking about the lady April described, hanging by her braid.
Story 7. Mysterious death.
One of my brothers worked security in one of New York City's most upscale hotels. The security desk received a frantic call during one of his night shifts. A man was calling, extremely upset, saying his wife was in the bathtub and was not breathing. My brother and another security guard rushed upstairs to the room. Sure enough, they found a woman in the bathtub, unresponsive. My brother and the other guard managed to get her out of the tub and attempted cardiopulmonary resuscitation. During their attempts, the New York Police Department arrived. They told my brother to stop the cardiopulmonary resuscitation because the woman was obviously dead and, in their opinion, had been for a couple of hours. The husband was questioned extensively. He told law enforcement that he and his wife had argued earlier in the evening and he went out by himself. When he came back, his wife was in the bathtub. He said he went to bed at that point but became concerned when his wife did not come to bed later Privately, among those present, the general consensus was that the husband had something to do with her death, but it could not be proven. A couple of weeks later, the room was made available to guests again, and, of course, the incident was not mentioned. A woman who frequently stayed at the hotel made a reservation for a week and was assigned to that room. She was the first person to stay in the room since the incident. She came to the front desk the next morning, very upset, with all of her luggage in tow. She said she was cancelling the rest of her reservation and would never stay at the hotel again. She said that she had not slept the entire night and that the room was haunted. No one at the hotel had mentioned what had previously occurred in the room. While my brother worked there, every guest who stayed in that room called about strange occurrences, and many asked to be moved to another room.
Story 8. Ghost in Japan.
I should start off by saying my brother is not only a military man, but he's your basic, stereotypical, never let them see you cry type of military man. He's not afraid of anything, well, except for the entire country of Japan. This is his story. My brother joined the Marines when he was 18 and was stationed in Japan. He really enjoyed his time there for a while, especially the girls. He made friends with some of the Japanese guys his age who worked around the base. On nights when he and his soldier friends had the night off, the local Japanese guys would show them around, take them to bars, introduce them to girls, etc. One night, after a little drinking and no luck with girls, one of the guys invited my brother to his home to play video games. My brother accepted the invite, and they played video games for a few hours. During this time, the guy told my brother that the main reason he wanted to get home early was that his little sister had been suffering from night terrors, causing her to wake up screaming, crying, and sometimes vomiting. He was worried about her and wanted to be home in case she had another episode. At this point, I should explain the layout of this guy's house. The house was built in the shape of a horseshoe with a garden in the middle. His bedroom was at the very edge of one side of the U shape, and his sister's room was all the way at the other end. So essentially they were across the garden from each other. If he looked out of his window, he could see into hers, and vice versa. So they decided to call it a night, and the Japanese guy walked over to the window to look across the garden into his sister's window to check on her. He lifted the blind and peered out for a fraction of a second before jumping back, screaming and looking at my brother like he just saw something horrible. My brother then went to look, but the guy stopped him. He said he saw a dark cloud with red eyes hovering over his sister's sleeping body. My brother, naturally, did not believe him and decided to look for himself. He quietly crept over to the window and lifted the blind. But this time, he found himself eye to eye with what he describes as a dark black puff of smoke with a face. My brother and the other guy admit that they both got under the covers and stayed there until it was light outside. Too afraid to lift the blankets and see that the smoky figure had come a little closer and was now in the room with them, just on the other side of the thin sheets. I don't know what to believe. Or if maybe they drank more than they said they did that night and imagined it all. But I know my brother believes what he saw. He sticks to his story, and when he tells it, he looks like someone who saw something truly sinister.
Story 9. Mysterious Book Ghost.
My school's library is open until around 2 in the morning for people like me who don't do their essays until the last minute. It's a pretty small building, and most of the books are in the basement area called the stacks. To give you a quick layout, there's the big main staircase that goes down to the stacks, a vending machine room, and a long hallway with 4 entrances into the stacks. The stacks are 2 really big rooms on opposite sides of the hallway, with a huge amount of bookshelves and study desks lining the walls. I was there around 11 p.m. last year. It was a pretty research-intensive essay, so I was down in the stacks working in one of the study desks, so I didn't have to keep going upstairs and downstairs. I had been there for maybe 2 hours, and everyone except for a boy working a few desks down from me had already left. I was pretty zoned out by this point. It was for an 8 a.m. class, so I didn't have much time left, and I was sort of panicking. That's when I got really annoyed by the sound of someone flipping through book pages really fast, to make them do that loud whir noise at the other end of the room. I sort of ignored it for a while, thinking they'd go away eventually, but they just kept doing it. After about 5 minutes, I got sick of it and started to walk over to tell them to stop. I got about 3 steps across the room and it just stopped. I sat back down, and it was quiet again for about 10 more minutes before the flipping pages noise started again, only much louder, like they'd grabbed a huge book that time. The boy started to get annoyed too, and he stood up, walking through the bookshelves to find them. The noise kept going, so I got up as well, and we started looking around together. By that point, the noise was really loud, and it was pretty obvious where it was coming from, so we started walking toward it. He was on one side of the shelves and I was on the other. We walked all the way down the shelves, but there was no one there. We hadn't seen anyone come into the stacks, and we were on the side of the room with the entrances. There was no way anyone could have come in without us seeing them. The noise stopped again, and we both just sort of slowly walked back to our seats. I assumed it was just a fan or something in the other room, and I really needed to get my essay done. We sat down and immediately the noise started again. This time it sounded like it was coming from right next to the boy's chair. He quickly shoved his stuff into his bag, looked at me, and said, "Forget this," before leaving. I was out of there maybe 5 seconds behind him. I still won't go back in the stacks at night, even when there are other people down there. No essay is worth getting hurt by a strange book ghost.
Story 10. Death's Silent Visitor.
I worked in a nursing home as a medical aide in a hospice unit. One night, I had 3 patients nearing the end of their lives, and my job was to ensure that they were comfortable. The other staff members I worked with at night were amazing. We always tried to make each other laugh to get through the night. I had a reputation for scaring the other girls. Sometimes I would hide in the closet of a room where someone had recently passed away, their body and belongings long gone, leaving the room empty, and I'd press the call light and wait. The girls would rush in to turn it off, but I'd always jump out and scare them. One night, I was in the nurse's station filling out a report because I had to administer some medication to a patient named Kent. Suddenly, an aide rushed in, claiming she thought she saw my shadow on the wall, as though I were hiding to scare her. However, she then heard me laughing in the nurse's station. I decided to check it out, as no one was supposed to be on our floor. I walked over to the wall where the light would have cast my shadow, but there was nothing there. I laughed it off until the certified nursing assistant started shrieking. I turned around and saw a shadow seemingly rise up the wall from the ground, appearing out of nowhere. I just stared at it and said, "Oh, for heaven's sake, is that the best you've got?" and walked back to the nurse's station. Later, I had to do rounds. As I was walking toward a patient's room, I heard 3 knocks on the door that led to the outside patio by the patient's room, and I saw an older gentleman dressed in all black. I couldn't let him in because I didn't have the access code, so I told him to hold on, and I would get the nurse to let him in. When the nurse and I returned to the door, he was gone. She went outside to search for him, but we couldn't find him, so I continued to check on my patient. There was blood everywhere, and the patient was on the floor, bleeding. It seemed that he had tried to get up, but had fallen and struggled on the floor. The nurse helped him back into bed, and we cleaned him up. Since he was a do not resuscitate or DNR patient, there was nothing else we could do except make him as comfortable as possible. I then went to my next patient's room and found that he had passed away. He had stopped breathing. I rushed to get the nurse and pulled his file to confirm that he too was a DNR patient. We called the morgue and his family while I cleaned his body with an aide. I went back to check on the patient who had fallen, and she was dead as well. I called for the nurse, and she was frustrated because now 2 aides were occupied with the deceased patients, and there was a lot of paperwork involved. As I walked down the hall to get linens, I saw the old man I had first seen outside walking past the nurse's station. He whispered, "One more, just one more, and then I'm done for the night." His voice was so eerie that I jumped up and followed him. As I reached the patient's room, the door slammed shut. When I went inside, the patient looked directly at me and took her last breath. Her eyes were still staring at me. I remember the window being open, which I thought was odd. I ran to the window but saw nothing outside. I slammed it shut, checked the patient for a pulse, and found none. The nurse had followed me and saw everything I had witnessed. She heard the voice whisper too. She had come around the corner and swore she saw the man, and then watched me run after him. She, like me, saw the patient's room door slam shut before I could get in. When I turned around, I saw the nurse standing in the doorway. She could only say, "I saw it too. Oh my God, I saw it too."
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.